will be made available to Jonathan for him to post for future viewings if you would like to review this video, this training in the future. All right, so continuing on with that, our enterprise solution is running on One Spatial's product called One Data Gateway. One Data Gateway is a web portal that runs on a rules engine. That rules engine actually hosts validations and enhancement processes that can be used between internal and external users. So the folks at Arkansas, the state office, and folks that are submitting data for validation. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, I've got a quick animation. So we have our data contributors, that's y'all. And we have Arkansas, which is hosting and One Spatial, which is hosting the One Data Gateway portal. So contributors will be able to upload your data to that portal. It will undergo a series of data validation rules. Those might be checking for essential geometry checks. For linear data, it could be essential network checks. For any of our NENA, the National Emergency Number Association, Next Generation 911 data, we do have those NENA attribute checks. So that's an entire validation that you can run your data through to ensure that it's meeting those standards. Now, once your data's gone through those validations, you will then be able to download those results. And you'll have the opportunity to address any issues that are found during that data validation process. You'll also have the ability to mark any data as exceptions. Maybe it's not necessarily a duplicate geometry. Maybe that's actually a stacked address point. So that should be marked as an exception. Now, once you've cleaned that data and marked your exceptions, you can then resubmit to the same processes. So the same validation. There's no limit on the number of times you can do that. So you can repeat that process over and over. And then once that data meets quality standards, once it meets conformance standards, you can then have that data and submit it to the state. So that data can then go to a central data repository. Now, this will essentially automate the data supply chain and help ensure that the data that is submitted is of a very high quality. There are two main processes that we are able to do with our One Data Gateway portal, and those are data validation. And that's where you are using your own tools to build and maintain your data. And then you submit the data through the portal in order to identify if there's any corrections or create exceptions to ensure that the data is meeting those standards, those conformance standards. Once the data meets those standards, you can then go through a data submission or change detection process. With change detection, what we do is we compare your current submission to a previous submission that lives within the central repository, and it will identify if there's any additions, deletions, or any attribute changes, so any scalar updates. Those changes are detected, and that is what is actually submitted to as change proposals to the central data repository. So the change proposals are what is then pushed to the repository, which kind of minimizes how much data is actually being pushed to that central data repository. So that's used to update that system and applied to the Arkansas database. Now that's the workflow within the portal itself. So what's the overall workflow for you as a contributor? Your overall workflow is going to begin and end with your data. So this is data that you're updating in a GIS software. If you happen to use ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro or QGIS, whatever your GIS software of choice is. It's recommended to have that data in WGS 84. And that's because once we actually get to the NENA Next Gen 911 data, that's preferred to be in WGS 84. And so sometimes when you're comparing data to one another that's not in the same projection, it can have some issues. So we recommend to reproject your data. We also need to compress any file geodatabases into compressed zipped files. When we upload data to the portal, we need to upload it as a file rather than as a folder. If you're looking at a file geodatabase within a system folder, it's a folder. So we just have to turn that into a zipped file before we upload it to the data or to the portal. Once we're done with our data prep, we can then take our data and submit it to the Enterprise Solution portal. This is a stepped process. So it goes through uploading the data. You're then going to map the schema from your source, from your uploaded data, to the schema that's within the Enterprise Solution portal. So you'll actually see the target schema that you need to map to, or you need to map from. You'll then run the submission. And during that submission, it'll actually let you know how many conformances, non-conformances are within your data based on the validation you're running that data against. And then finally, you'll be able to download a spatial report. You'll be able to download a results output. Those results you can then take and view again in your GIS viewer of choice. You can add the original data as well as that results output in order to view which data points or data features have been flagged as non-conformances based on that spatial report output. And then you can update your data as needed. You can flag exceptions as an exception. And once you've got that data updated and flagged your exceptions, you can then prep that data again, get it ready to go back through the portal. And you can repeat this process. There's no limit to how many times you submit data against a specific validation. So you have the ability to run that process as often as you would like. I mentioned that our portal workflow has a stepped process, and you'll see this stepped process within the portal as I run a submission today. So the workflow within the portal itself begins with uploading data. So we're going to choose a file to upload to our portal. We're then going to go to configure mapping, and this is where we're going to match our classes and our attributes from our data sets to the schema within our portal. We'll then start the submission process. That submission process runs on a queue, so each submission will be assigned to an engine that will run that validation. If 5 of us decide to submit a validate or a submission at the same time, it queues up those submissions and it will automatically run one submission after the next. So whichever one's next in the queue, it'll pick up and automatically run that one for us. Finally, once the submission process is finished, we'll be able to review and download our results. So going back to that overall workflow, I want to make sure my data is prepped before I run it or I upload it to the portal for submission. Again, our recommendation is to reproject your data into WGS84. And we also want to finish preparing our data by saving it in a file geodatabase and compressing that file geodatabase into a zipped file. So I have a file geodatabase here. I'm just going to right click it. We use 7-zip at OneSpatial, but if you happen to use something else to compress your files, that's what you would want to use in order to add that file geodatabase to a zipped file. Next up, we're going to go into our aggregation, validation and aggregation portal. So this is the Enterprise Solution. Before I log in and I get out of PowerPoint and we go into our actual portal, I just want to point out that you should have received an activation email. It should have come from admin@onespatial.com. You might, if you didn't receive one, you might want to check either spam or quarantine, because sometimes coming from a .com, it'll send those emails to a quarantine. But that email contains a link to activate your account. You want to click that link, and what it'll do is it'll take you to a page where you'll be able to create a password for your account. please remember your password. We can reset it if need be, but you're going to take that password and then you're going to log in with your username and the password you created. Your username is the email address that received the activation email. So, for example, I created an account for myself. My username for the Arkansas portal is going to be carolyn.kupek@onespatial.com. That's the email that received that activation email. And so that's going to be my username. If I need to change that username, I do need to contact my site administrator, and they'll be able to update that username. And I have seen a few chats come in. As you see here at the bottom of this slide, if you have not received that activation email, or if you have any issues logging into the portal, please let us know in the chat now. I do have a couple colleagues from OneSpatial, Sarah and John, that should be able to help with getting you to log into the portal. So I'm going to go to my portal now. So you can see here we have our login page where I'm going to be able to put in my username, put in my password. I will also copy and paste this website into the chat. So if you do want to bookmark that page, I tend to have all my One Data Gateway portals bookmarked, just to make it easy to return to that site. So again, once you receive that activation email, click the link. It'll prompt you to create a password. Create your password, and then you're going to log in with that email and that password you just created. And when you sign in, your portal should look similar to this. And I'll give folks a couple minutes. And as Sarah has mentioned in the chat, she'll resend activation emails to any of you that are reporting it in the chat. So if you did not receive the link or the email with the link to activate your account, just please let us know in the chat now. For those that have logged in, what you're seeing here is our NG911 Enterprise portal. So on the left, you have a navigation pane. We have 3 interfaces that we can interact with in the portal. You have My Assignments, Submissions, and My Account. I'll go over submissions in My Account later if we have time. But most of our work is going to be done here in My Assignments. I also want to point out at the top right, you have 3 icons here. You've got a bell, which is notifications, a little bar graph, which is any current submissions that are open. I actually have a couple submissions that are open, so I can show you what those look like. And then I also have my little avatar. And this is where I can go to my account, or I can sign out of the portal. The token for signing in and out of portals does expire after 24 hours. So if you sign in today and you don't sign in again until later this week, you may need to sign back in. But if you sign in within 24 hours, sometimes it will keep you open if you haven't actually logged out of the portal. So within my PowerPoint here, at the end of this training, I do provide a PDF version of my PowerPoint to Jonathan and his team, so he will have it for his records. So if in the future you need to go back through this training, or if you'd like to go back through that PowerPoint. I do have all of the information I'm giving you when I'm in the portal here in the PowerPoint as well. So pointing out where you can find current submissions, the user avatar, as well as those notifications. And I'll explain the current submissions icon and how to use it, as well as the notifications icon throughout our training today, or later in our training. I did see a hand raised. Was there a question? Yes, Chris, do you have a question? I think you have to unmute yourself in the meeting.
There we go. Got it. So I'm sorry about that. I don't have the, I for some reason don't have the chat function on mine. It's not showing up. And I did not receive, or I cannot find the email with my activation for on here. So in my email from yesterday or whenever y'all sent it out.
Okay. I believe
Chris,
Sarah
yeah.
and
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, Chris, I'll get that sent back out to you. So it'll be coming from One Spatial admin. So yeah, take a look for that shortly.
Okay, thank you.
all right. So for those of y'all that have been able to log in, feel free to follow along as I go through my assignments and the portal interface. Those of y'all that are waiting on that email, you're welcome to kind of watch as I go through. I am going to be doing a demonstration of a submission. I don't assume everyone has data prepared to run against one of these submissions, but you'll actually be able to see how submitting data to the portal will work. So the main part of our interface is My Assignments. Within My Assignments, you'll actually see an assignment card representing each validation that you can submit data against. So within the Arkansas Public Safety Enterprise Solution, we have SSAP, which is the Site Structure Address Points. You might know it better as ADP, or just address points. But anything that has SSAP, those are our address points. So I have validations that I can submit for essential geometry checks. So just checking, are there any duplicate geometries? For points, are they valid or simple based on the Open Geospatial Consortium definitions of valid geometry and simple geometry? We also have the address point NINA attributes. So if you have your address points and they're in the NINA attribute schema or the NINA schema, you can submit that data against the NINA attribute assignment, and it'll run it against those NINA requirements. We also have address point to address point validations. That's just checking your address points against themselves. There's a couple checks within that validation. That's just ensuring your data is meeting certain standards. I will point out that we do have rule catalogs for each of these validations. That is a PDF that you can find once you go into one of these assignment cards. I do want to focus on submitting to an assignment first, and then I'll show you some of that additional functionality within the portal. So submitting to an assignment, I've mentioned before, it's a stepped process. So we're going to upload our data, we're going to map our data, we're going to run that submission, and then we'll have our submission results as an output. So to show you that in the portal, I'm just going to choose my very first assignment card here, which is my essential geometry for address points. You'll see here submissions, information, that's where any documentation for that particular validation lives. So I mentioned a rule catalog, so I do have a rule catalog here I can download. There's a dashboard, which I will talk about after we submit an assignment. And saved mappings, which I'll also address after we run a submission. So let's look at submissions here. You can see any previous submissions you've done. I've done a couple yesterday as I was testing the service. And back in October when we were initially getting the solution set up. You can see the state of these submissions, if there's an outcome, and then clicking these gray boxes can go to any of those previous submissions. I want to start a new submission. So in the bottom right corner, there's a start a new submission. Going to my PowerPoint, I'm going to click start a new submission in order to kick off a new submission for this one assignment. Oh, I do want to point out, you can see here in my screenshot, if you haven't created any new submissions, it'll just say no matching submissions until you start a new submission, and it'll start having those submissions lined up under that submissions tab for that specific assignment. So starting a new submission, you have our first step of the process, that upload data. So I'm going to start my new submission. Now, a couple things I want to point out here. You have the data set. So here, this is an essential geometry check. So it's just looking for submitted data to the portal. The second data set is what's called new exceptions. So if I've marked up or flagged in my output any exceptions, I'm going to be able to submit that as a file geodatabase to the system as well. We do have file type listed here. So these are expecting file geodatabases. Required indicates whether I need to submit data to that particular data set or if I don't. Now, you don't need to submit exceptions every time you run a submission. So I do need to submit my submitted data for this assignment. So that's why I've got a check mark under required for that data set. But my exceptions, there's no check mark. So I don't need to upload data for that one unless I have it. So I'm going to, you have two options. You can click within those delineated fields to browse for a file, or you can drag and drop. So I'm going to drag and drop some data. Once it's uploaded and it does a quick check, it'll let you know upload successful in the bottom left corner. It'll also let me know that my submission is ready to run and my continue button is now blue, indicating it's ready for me to move to the next step in the process. If you're reviewing the data and you're like, oops, that's a completely wrong file that I uploaded, you do have a little trash can here that can remove that. Or again, you can click in that delineated area and navigate to the correct file to upload. So I'm going to click continue to move on to the next step in our process. The next step is configure mapping. Now what this is going to do is it's going to take my source, my uploaded data, and it's going to find its schema mapping, and it's going to give me target data, target schema that I need to map to. So here I have that data set. If I had multiple data sets that I uploaded, I would have additional drop downs that I could choose from. I only submitted my one data gateway submitted data, so I only have that one data set to map. In the future, if you're doing cross-feature validations, or if you're comparing one data set to another data set, and you have to upload multiple data sets, you will need to use that in order to choose which data set you're mapping. So you're going to map one at a time. I'm going to scroll down. Class name, this is a feature that if you are looking for a specific class within, here I've got my target classes on the left. But if I switch and if I have multiple, for example, I have multiple source classes. I have 2 classes within my file geodatabase from Franklin County. You can use class name to narrow down. So I just put in point, it narrowed down to just the points. If I don't use that, it'll give me all the source classes. Now you might have noticed I've swapped my schema as to which schema is on my left. So that double arrow back and forth, if I hover over it, it says swap schema mapping direction. By default, it starts with target to source. It's assuming that you know your source class, your source classes, your source attributes. And so the drop downs here are going to be my source classes, and later on I'll show you the source attributes. If you'd prefer to map from your uploaded data to the target schema in the portal, you can swap that mapping direction. So you have that ability to swap it one way or the other. You can also narrow down the mapping status. So for mapping complete or mapping required. Now, once we select a target and source to map, I'm going to map my points to my feature class. I'm choosing points because if I remember the assignment I'm submitting to, this is for my point, my SSAP geometry. So I'm going to stick with my points for this one. Once I've chosen a class to map, I then will be able to open this drop-down menu, and it will show me the attributes for those classes. Now, my target is what's in the portal itself. For essential geometry checks, you just need a unique identifier or a unique ID and the geometry. If the portal identifies a perfect match between attributes, so here geometry is a perfect match. It's the same case, it's the same spelling, so it identifies that as a match between the two attribute lists. It doesn't identify a unique ID within my source attribute list. So I'm going to choose this menu here. So I'm just going to click within that area. And from my attributes for my source, I'm going to find my unique identifier. So usually it's site ID, NGUID for the next generation unique identifier. I'm going to choose that as the class I'm going to map from my target or to my target. Again, you can always swap the mapping direction. Because I swapped it, I now have points and lines I can map. I only need to map one target class. So I'm going to expand that. And here you can see all of my source. The source is now on my left. All of my source attributes. You can see geometry mapped over. And if I scroll down, it kept that site ID to my unique identifier. As you're mapping, you'll notice check marks next to attributes and classes that have been mapped, and gray question marks next to attributes and classes that have not been mapped. If you make a mistake and say, for example, I set seat to unique ID, if I choose unique ID again for site, it overwrites that. If I need to delete any mapping, there is a trash can next to those mappings, and I can just click that and it will remove the mapping. Now, let's say we have a configure mapping step that is a lot more steps, a lot more attributes to map. Essential geometry is pretty straightforward because we just have our unique identifier and our geometry. Assignments such as the NINA attribute validations, those have us mapping a lot more attributes. This can be very time intensive. And so sometimes what we want to do is we want to save our schema mappings. So you can actually click at the very top of our schema mapping, manage schema mappings. Once you've completed that mapping initially, you can click the manage schema mappings and then you can save the mapping. So you may save up to 10 schema mappings per assignment. That's helpful if you're submitting data from multiple locations or multiple PSAPs or multiple counties. You can save a mapping per assignment, up to 10 mappings per assignment. Later on, I will show you where you can access those saved mappings and you can edit them in the future if you need to make edits. But we can also save these. So we can say address, points, and save. So now I see address PTS was a previous mapping. If I use that, it's going to have 0% mapped. That's not great for this data that I'm submitting through these essential geometry checks. But the mapping I just saved, address points, 100% of my data is mapped. In the future, if I want to resubmit this data and I want to apply this saved mapping, I just need to go to that Manage Schema Mappings, click Apply, and that will use that saved mapping for this assignment. That'll save you a lot of time once you're getting into those validations that have a lot more attributes and classes to map. For these essential geometry checks, they're pretty easy to map because it's just a couple attributes. But again, those NINA attributes, I think there's 54 attributes to map for road center lines. So it can save you time in the future. Since I have my mapping saved, I'm going to hit close. Some other things I'm going to point out here, there are symbols that you may have noticed have changed as I'm mapping. The target classes, you can see I now have a green check mark. It's indicating that the mapping is complete. The orange triangle with the exclamation mark is just indicating that the mapping is incomplete for my source classes. And that's because I have an extra class that I'm not mapping. I am not concerned about it at the moment because those are lines, and I'm more concerned about my address points for this assignment. Since I have my mapping done, you'll also notice at the bottom, it's indicating I have unmapped source data, but all of my target classes and target attributes are mapped. Now, I'm just going to switch my mapping direction real quick because it's easier just to see the two here. Let me remove that site and NGUID. It is indicating that I am not able to proceed if I have unmapped data that is a requirement to map before continuing. So here, my continue button is no longer available to me. It's giving me a red, you have unmapped data. So I have to have that one mapped before I'm allowed to continue on. Now that my target data is mapped, now I can continue to the next step. So if you get to that point and that continue button is not ungraying itself, it's not going blue, review that mapping and make sure that you have those attributes that are required, those classes that are required, make sure that those are mapped.
Hey, Carolyn, can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Jennifer at the GIS office. And over the past few weeks, I'd been playing around with saving my mapping and noticed that it wasn't saving. And I'm sure it's because I was doing something wrong. And I think it was because I wasn't clicking apply. Have y'all noticed anything like that? Hello?
Yeah, Carolyn, do you want to go through the process of saving again?
Yeah.
Did you hit? Well, it'll make more sense when she pulls it up. I think there's another button you need to hit.
So if you're choosing from that manage schema mappings, you do need to hit apply from a previously saved mapping.
Yeah, no, my problem was after I saved it and I thought I'd saved it, I would go to try to use it again and it wasn't there.
And it's the same schema mapping, and so you saved it as a mapping within the same assignment.
Okay, so maybe that's so if you have 3 different address point assignments, right?
Mhm.
You have to do the mapping, you have to save the mapping for each one of those separately.
Yeah,
there
there is a feature. Sorry, Carolyn was
Don't
probably
worry.
just going to say this.
You're
There's
gonna
a
say
way to
copy schema mapping.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to mention something else that was a trick too, but yeah,
Well,
yeah, I lost
I mean,
it.
it was a bit frustrating, so I don't know, I'm trying not to let other people be as frustrated. I don't know what I was doing wrong, because sometimes it was there and sometimes it wasn't, so it was probably something I just wasn't understanding. So yeah, if you guys get to a point where you can show like how to copy it over or whatever, I think that would be helpful.
Oh yeah, and I was going to mention if the feature class if the feature class name is different, you will need to save a new mapping for that specific feature class. So if the name is a little bit different, say you have, site structure address points, and then you go and you try to run another address point data set, but it just says address points, you'll need to save that mapping as well, because the name of the feature class is different.
All right.
And I will say, if you have different assignments, say you have an assignment for Franklin County and you have an assignment for Benton County and you have an assignment for Baxter County, those are 3 different assignments. And so your schema mappings are saved per assignment. So we do have a way that you can copy a saved schema mapping. Say the schema is the same for all 3 of those counties. You can copy from one assignment to another. So especially once you've done those NINA attribute validations and you've saved your schema mapping, in the future, when you have access to cross-feature validations, you can actually copy from those NINA attribute validation assignments to the cross-feature validation assignments. And I will show you that once I get through our submission, because it's back in, it's those save schema mappings section within the assignment card. No worries. All right. So this one I'm ready to continue on. So I'm going to click continue. This is going to go to that next step in our process. So we've uploaded our data, we've configured our schema mapping. Now it's going to run our submission. I do need to scroll up. So you'll see submission status. You'll see number of tasks. There's 22 in this one, and current status. So it started as not started. It will automatically find an engine that will pick it up and it will run it. So it does run fairly quick. I can see it going through. You can watch this, so you can expand out. You can see how many features are running through. This is 9,000 features. You don't have to stay here. You can navigate away. So you can see it's still run. Well, it's paused at the moment because it's actually processing the final task. You can navigate away. You can go back to my assignments. You can look at a different assignment. I'm going to show you how to get back to that submission that was running in a very fast way. So I mentioned that current submission icon. It's that bar graph at the top right. I just clicked it. You can see I've got a number 4 up there because I have 4 open submissions. The one I just ran is this one that's submission processed. It's got a little pause next to it because it's on that process step, but it's been paused because it's waiting for me to go back and step it to the next step. I also have a submission that I canceled. I have a submission that I ran successfully last night. And I have a submission I started, but it's on that configure mapping step. If I click on any of these, it's going to take me to that specific submission. So it's a hot link to that submission. So this is one that I started yesterday, but I didn't finish. If I want to go to the one that I just was processing, I'm going to go to that top one. Now I'm back here. So a couple things I want to point out. We are still on that process submission step. I can scroll through. I can take a look at each one of these steps. How many features are being processed? Each task does have a description label. So we have loading our submitted data, loading the spatial report. These are empty classes that are basically going to be how we're going to be writing out our final output from the submission. So they're empty right now. If it finds any non-conformances, any data that does not conform to the validation checks within this submission, it will write a markup object to one of these classes. If it's a point, it'll write it to markup point. If it's a line indicating a linear feature that has failed one of these checks, it'll write it to markup line. And it will create a table called markup summary, and it will summarize all of the markups within the spatial report. So I can scroll through. The 100% required you see after each one of these fields is the conformance requirement. So in order to get a green thumbs up saying, yes, it meets that conformance requirement, it has to match or be higher than that conformance percentage. So here it has to be 100% correct for each one of these checks. If you'd like more information on each one of these checks, like what is a self-intersection, what is a spike, that is all described in our rule catalog. So under information for the assignment, you'll see the rule catalog. You can download that PDF and you can read more about what is a spike, what is a kickback. These are points, so I don't expect to see any spikes or kickbacks because that's more of a linear or a polygon issue that might occur. But I do see I have some duplicate features. So because this one did not meet that requirement, it gets a red thumbs down. I see 9,277 of my points out of 9,285 passed, but there's some that didn't. So those are actually going to be summarized. So it's summarizing our point issues. There's 4 that are going to have a markup point created for them. My final task is an export spatial reports. So you can actually see I have 4 markup points. A markup point is just going to be a flag for that non-conforming object. It'll say, hey, there's a duplicate feature here. And then my markup summary is just going to be a table that summarizes all of the issues. So I only have 1 record within that markup summary, and that's because I only have 1 task where I had data fail that task, that did not conform to that task. So I'm not yet done. I need to go to that final step, output results. I'm going to go click continue. It's going to take me to my submission results. It's got to calculate them. But once it's done, I'll actually be able to download a PDF report. I'll be able to download both my input and my output. Data is retained. I'm not sure if Arkansas's requirements, I think it's 6 months. But data is retained for a time. If I come back a year from now, I may not be able to access the input or output data, but it is retained for a time period. So I can download my input, I can download my output, which I'm going to go ahead and do. I can view a report. You can hide tasks that did not finish. All of my tasks finished, so that's not really something I would be concerned about. You could hide tasks with no process features. I'll just leave them. I'm going to hit generate PDF. This PDF is actually going to take all of this information here. It's going to expand out all of these, so it'll actually tell me for each task how many features were processed through. And for each of our tasks that is actually reporting a conformance standard or reporting to a conformance standard, it'll have the number of features that were valid and the number of features that did not pass. So let's take a look at that PDF report. Again, it also has all of my metadata. It also lists the assignment, project, and the supplier, which I haven't mentioned just yet, but I will get into that, that I've submitted this assignment through. You'll see the uploaded data. So I didn't have any uploaded file for my spatial reports because that was actually already within the portal. But you'll see the data that has been loaded, each task here. There's some exceptions here. Again, if I was to upload data exceptions, those would be processed on those steps. And then it gets into each of the checks within the validation itself. So again, all of this information is just a repeat from this screen here. That way you don't have to screenshot this screen. You don't have to try to select all and paste into a Word document. It's all here within that PDF report. So if you want a copy of that for yourself, you can download that. And that's the view report. So I can review all of this information here. Each one of these tasks I can expand out. I can review anything. Sometimes we do combine multiple tasks into one. You'll see that for the NINA attribute validations, we combine the mandatory NINA checks all together, the conditional checks all together, and the optional attribute checks all together. So you can expand those out and you can see all the mandatory ones, all the mandatory attributes, all the conditional attributes, all the optional attributes. Now, once I'm done with my submission, I can hit close submission. That's going to close it out. It does remove it from my open submissions up here because now it's closed. We do try to use these as sort of a task list, like a to-do. These are the open submissions I'm working on at the moment. And those do time out. After 24 hours, it'll automatically close an open submission. I can also click on my supplier name. So my supplier is One Spatial Test. If I click on that, it goes back to my original assignment screen, my assignment interface. You can see here is that assignment I just ran. The state is a check mark because it's finished, and the outcome was successful. If your outcome was canceled, so say, for example, you started a submission, you're like, I'm not quite ready to continue with this, you can always cancel the submission. Or if you've gotten to the configure mapping step, and you're like, whoa, this is the wrong data altogether, you can cancel that submission, and it does record it, but it'll just sit there as a submission canceled. If you want to go back to that results screen, that gray button at the far right will take you back to the submission results. And again, you can download data if that's still available. You can also download that PDF report. Another thing I want to point out, you can see a processing time. So if you have started a submission 5 p.m. on a Tuesday and you come back 9 a.m. on a Wednesday and you didn't start a stopwatch yourself, you have a processing time here. So it'll actually tell you how long it took. This took 14 seconds. It is fairly quick. The more data, this is only 9,000 points, but if you're running like 100,000 points, it will take a little bit longer, but it shouldn't take forever. The submissions should process fairly quickly. And you'll also see how many tasks processed through. I also want to point out that every single submission has a unique reference code. If for any reason you happen to come across an error and it says submission error, you do have a unique reference code. You can click the little button that says copy to clipboard and it will copy that. Say copy to clipboard. You can also highlight it, right click copy. And then if you need to report an issue to your site administrator, you can reach out to Jonathan. You can let him know that this is the submission reference code so that he can actually go to that specific submission and see, oh, okay, that's what's going on here. Or it might be something that needs to be escalated up to One Spatial, and then we can go in and we can take a look at that specific submission. Now I have this copied to my clipboard, so I do want to show you in submissions, you'll see every single submission that you have actually run. So these are all some of the submissions I've done previously. If I'm searching for a specific submission, and these are just closed submissions, so the guys that I have up here that other than the canceled one, this one that's ready, this one's actually not going to be listed in my submissions because it's not finished. So my finished ones I'll see here. If I want to jump to a specific one, I have a jump to at the bottom right corner. I can put in that submission reference code, hit jump to, and it'll take me to that submission. That reference code is also in that PDF report. So if I was to look at that submission report, I can see it. Should be listed somewhere here. Oh, it should be listed in these. But yeah, it should be a unique reference code that you can use to access that submission, those results again. Okay. A couple other things I'm going to point out while we're here in my assignments. I mentioned a supplier. So if you happen to be submitting from multiple organizations, multiple counties, you may see more than one assignment for essential geometry checks for address points. You may see multiple SSAP essential geometry. What'll change is after essential geometry, instead of One Spatial Test, you might see Baxter County, or you might see Benton County, or you might see Franklin County, whichever you happen to see. The icon at the top right will also change. So each assignment card is going to be an assignment for each county or for each PSAP or for each organization that you're submitting data on behalf of. You're going to want to submit the correct data for each supplier. So if I have Franklin County data, I want to submit to the Franklin County assignment. I mentioned that you can actually copy saved mappings. So during the submission process, we did that configure mapping step and we managed that schema mapping. You can access that under saved mappings. So earlier I just had address points, PTS. I also have address points spelled out up here. You can create a new mapping. You can copy a saved mapping. So the little plus icon at the bottom right, I'm going to click that. I can either create a new saved mapping. I can copy from a different assignment as well. So I can filter by mapping name. Maybe I want to look at just those that have been created for Benton County. Maybe I want to filter for those that have address in the name. So it's only by the mapping name that it'll filter by. If there's additional mappings here, you can scroll. You can also use the arrows to navigate between the mappings. But essentially, I want to select a mapping. Let's say, for example, I want to select this Benton County one. I'm going to go next. I need to either choose a data set to copy. Do I want to copy mappings from one of these? And then which data set do I want to copy it to? Do I want to copy it to my submitted data? Or do I want to copy it to my new exceptions? So I'm going to copy the data set to copy to under assign data sets. Let's say I want to copy it to this one. Next, we then just have a copy mapping. So this is where I'm going to put in a mapping name. Maybe I'm just going to say it's Benton address points. Or I need to give a unique name per assignment. So Benton address points work because I don't have that already for this particular assignment. And then I would hit copy. I'm not going to continue with this one. I'm just going to hit cancel. But once you do actually create either a brand new saved mapping or a copied saved mapping, you'll see this screen here. You'll have settings. So again, you can change the name of a mapping that you've saved. Sample data. This is where if I had copied that mapping, I would actually have saved a saved data set that's going to be basing that mapping on. And then under schema mapping itself, let me actually drag and drop my sample data here, because it does need that in order to do the schema part. Schema mapping is going to be very reminiscent of our configure mapping step during a submission. I'm not doing a submission, however, I'm just mapping. So I can say, once I do this mapping here, save mapping unique ID to site and GUID. I'm going to hit save. It'll save that mapping. It now knows the sample data to base it on. And in the future, when I run an assignment, I can go into that manage schema mapping and choose this mapping to use during that submission. And again, during that submission, I would just hit apply in order to apply a saved schema mapping during that configure mapping step. So this is something you can do outside of a submission. If you want to prepare schema mapping for a submission, you can save that schema mapping ahead of time by going through those steps, uploading the sample data, and then doing the schema mapping ahead of time. But you can also create those saved schema mappings during a submission. Just remember to click Manage Schema Mappings at the top of the page and save that mapping. And then you'll see that. I'm just going to click One Spatial Test to get back to here. You'll see those saved mappings for the assignment here. One thing I also mentioned I would review. We do have for each assignment a dashboard. So as you're running data through, you'll see a dashboard. The dashboard for that assignment it will begin to populate itself. So here I've got a date range from October 29th through today, November 29th. By default, it starts at a month. I usually like to start from since I started submitting data against assignments. So I'll start October 1st for this one because I know I've had data be submitted through multiple times. You'll see top violated rules. So here we have 10 checks within that validation. If I hover, should be able to hover a little bit over check for duplicate, but you'll actually start seeing these violated rules starting to populate. So maybe you'll see that you have a lot of mandatory NINA attribute checks that are not, the data is not passing those checks. So that might be a violated rule that is recorded here. You can also check your submissions by day. So you'll see some days I'm submitting twice a day, some days I'm only doing once, and these are completed submissions. So again, these that are in process, I've not actually finished running this one where the submission is ready. So that's not going to actually show up as a submission for this day. And then the final graph here is conformance over time. So if I hover over any of these points, you'll actually see my conformance for that data as it's running through. Overall, how is the data matching up? I just have that one duplicate check that keeps failing. So my most recent submission is at a 99.99. Ideally, this conformance over time will increase. So maybe the next time once I fix those duplicate points, I'll be at 100%. Mentioning fixing duplicate points, I've had my fun here in the portal. I've run my submission. I've downloaded my output. I am ready to move to the next part of my workflow, and that is going to be reviewing that output in a GIS viewer. It's going to be choosing any, flagging any as exceptions, and then I'm going to be resubmitting my data through the portal. So I'm going to run through these. Again, the entire process that I pointed out to you is here in the slide deck. So you're seeing a lot of the same things I pointed out. So that it is here as a PDF in the future if you need to come back and take a look and review my slide deck or review the training recording. So it's just all repeated information. Oh, I do want to point out some icons that you might see within those open submissions, and it's just referring to what stage of the submission process you're in. So if it's not started, you're on the upload data task. If it's ready, you're on that configure mapping, or if it's on one of those process submission or submission result steps. Again, if you do happen to get a submission error, you do have that unique reference code that you can use to refer to your submission. And then we do have that continue button to move to the final stage, our submission data report we can download, and then closing our submission. We did talk about our submissions. You can also filter using a date range filter to help find a specific submission. So once you've been going through and submitting your data multiple times, maybe you want to come back to your very first submission that you ran, just use the date range filter to find that. And again, it does give you outputs for the gray icon. Information again, rule catalogs, our dashboard where you can monitor your conformance over time or the submissions by day. And now we're ready for results analysis. Again, we had our fun in the portal. We're downloading our results. So I'm going to be here in my submission. I'm going to click that output button. I'm going to download those results, and I'm going to get into my GIS. I'm using QGIS today. So here is my address points that I submitted, and we're going to really hope that QGIS doesn't crash on me. It sometimes does if I ignore it for too long. But you'll see in that spatial report are outputs called markups. So you see markup point, markup line, markup area, markup summary. If I submit address points, I'm actually only going to see markup points because it can't create a line from points or a area from points unless we're doing a cross feature validation. But I only have points that I submitted, so I only have markup points as an output and a markup summary table. I keep saying markups. What do I mean by markups? Those are essentially just little flags representing our non-conforming data. A markup isn't going to have all the same attributable information that our original data has. So we recommend adding your original uploaded data and the results output to your GIS. That way, if you want to use a feature to find that information, you can click an identifier feature, for example, and identify that feature and information about that feature with its overlaying markup point. Let's check on QGIS. There we go. So here I have a spatial report. This is my summary. So the summary, markup summary, is essentially going to tell me my class. So again, I mapped my address points to my feature class in the portal. So it's going to refer to my class as feature. You might see that change with other submissions, other validations that go through. The class count. So again, I had 9,285 features go through this particular assignment. So that's the class count, how many features, how many objects have passed through. And violations. So if I expand that out, there were only 4 of those 9,285 features that failed, that violated that particular check. And that check was for duplicate features. So when I take a look at my spatial report for my markup output, I'm going to turn that on. You can see the 4 red explosion dots there. And if I view that attribute table, you'll actually see for each one of these markups, there's that one. Again, the class, a comment. So this one has duplicate geometry. If I have a feature that fails multiple checks within my validation, I'll potentially see different comments for each markup point. Maybe it's a duplicate geometry and it failed a duplicate vertice check. If it's got duplicates there, or if it's got multiple markups, you'll actually see multiple markups for one individual point. You'll also see a feature ID. So that I can use to refer back to my original uploaded data. So I can go to site 2294 and I can take a look at it. Maybe it's a stacked address point and I need to mark that as a exception because maybe it's apartments and it has duplicate geometry because there's multiple addresses at that one location. And again, violation, that does also correspond to that markup summary. And again, it's because it failed that one task, checking for duplicate features. So this is what's going to be within our markup point attribute table. You also see confidence, exception, relative feature ID, and severity. Oftentimes confidence and severity and relative feature ID are not populated. If I need to identify an object as an exception, what I'm going to do is in the exception field here, I'll start an editing session and I will just put in a text. Maybe that is a stacked address point and it's okay. It's an exception to our rule. I just need to change that. This is a string field, so I just need to put in some text to give it a reason as to why it's an exception. I would then save that table and re-upload to that assignment both my data and then my exception table. My exception table, or my exceptions file geodatabase rather, it's just going to be my markups with those exception fields updated. So again, here in my PowerPoint, I just have an explanation of the different types of markup layers that you might see in that output. as well as some of the attributes you might see. And I've already discussed the exception handling, but essentially the process is you're submitting that data, you're reviewing those spatial reports, you're going to update that data and flag any of those exceptions. You're going to change that exception field. And then you're going to resubmit your original data with those exceptions. Or actually, you're going to resubmit your data if you've made any edits to it. And then you're also going to submit exceptions as well. So that's our exception handling. Again, you're going to flag your exceptions. This is just stepping you through. That exception field, you're just going to type in the reason for the exception. Any string will satisfy that. It'll identify it as an exception when you upload it within that optional new exceptions field. There we go. And then you're going to remember on that configure mapping step, you will need to map both the submitted data as well as the new exceptions. Some frequently asked questions I've seen so far with our exception handling. What sort of data can be submitted? Again, the schema for exceptions is based on our markup output results. So that's spatial report. So if you use that spatial report and you flag within that exception field, you can just save those markups as your exceptions and then upload them to the new exceptions as a data set for an assignment. Submitting exceptions is optional, so you do not necessarily have to submit exceptions every time you run a submission. But if you do find exceptions and you want to mark them up, you will need to upload those new exceptions when you run a submission. The exceptions are stored in a central data repository for Arkansas. So if you create new exceptions and you upload them and you run the submission, they're now stored as exceptions for that assignment. The next time I come back, I don't need to re-upload those exceptions unless I have new ones to add. And then if you need to remove an exception, on the exception field, just set that back to null. And then the next time you submit that data, you're going to next time you resubmit that data, you are going to upload those exceptions so that it identifies that it needs to remove them from the central data repository. So the other tab that we talked a little bit about and I showed you was submissions. Again, if you want to go back and take a look at those previous submissions, that is within the submissions tab of, that's a poorly done screenshot, but you can review those submissions. You can use a date range filter or even an outcome filter to help you find a specific submission. There are gray bars here on the submissions. So we can also, if we want to add in project, specification, assignment. So we do group our layers by project. So you'll notice our projects are all by address layer or road center line or PSAP or provisioning boundary or fire law EMS. Specifications are if you're running mean attribute validations versus essential geometry validations versus for road center lines, network validations. And then assignment would be if it's depending on which supplier group you're submitting on behalf of. So if you're submitting on behalf of the Arkansas GIS office versus Benton County or Franklin County, etc. And it does show you the outcomes, and it also provides those gray action icons, so you can access those icons or that information, those output, but those results pages for each one of those submissions. And again, I did show you the jump to. So if you need to go and take a look at a specific submission and you have that reference ID, you can use that jump to get to that reference or to get to that submission. And again, you can add different columns. Excuse me. Those default columns are user, supplier, created at, and outcome. You can turn those off, you can turn those on, depending on your preference. And then finally, again, submission details. You'll see that for each one of the submissions, if your submission was canceled, or if your submission did not complete or did not finish with output data that you can download, you'll actually see like no data, which I'll show you with my canceled submission here. So my canceled submission, let me scroll over. So this one here, it'll say media for the submission has been removed because I canceled it and it didn't get to the point where it could upload my input data. So I canceled this data. There's no media available for me to download. I can still view a report, but there's no tasks because this was canceled before I got to the submission process. The very last part I want to mention is my account. So if you want to change your user avatar in my account, you can change it to different preset colors, different preset options, or if you have an avatar image you would like to upload and use as your avatar, you can do that as well. If you need to change your password, you can also change your password using your current password here. You can also, if you forget your password and you're attempting to log in, contact your administrator. They can send you a password reset link. And for profile, you can update your name. So if you need to change your name from Carolyn to One Spatial, you can do so. Your email is your username. So if you need to change your email, you need to contact your site administrator and they will be able to update your email because that is associated with your username. And we do have a couple different language options. By default, it should be in English US, but if you would like to change it to the UK version of English or Spanish, or we also offer it in Welsh, you can change any of the language settings to those three. I believe we are trying to work on a French language for our browser. I leave mine in English, US. If you do make any updates to your profile, just don't forget to hit update profile and that will save those changes. I do want to leave us with some tips, tricks, and lessons learned from other clients we've had that have submitted data through the portal. First tip, complete your essential validations first. So not just running your data through essential validations, but also taking that feedback and making edits to your data based on the markups that have come out of essential validations. What that's going to do is provide you with clean data before you go to the advanced validations. If you don't have clean data, so for example, if I have linear data that has duplicate vertices and spikes and kickbacks and it's a little messy, and I attempt to run that through a cross-feature validation where I'm comparing my road center lines to my address points, that's going to cause issues in that advanced cross-feature validation. If I have clean data that I'm running through, I shouldn't encounter as many issues as I would if I have data that has some essential geometry issues with it. So run through those essential geometry validations. They are currently available, so you should be able to run your address points, your road center lines, your boundary data through essential geometry. Just make sure you're choosing the correct assignment for each layer. Review the information tab for your assignments. That information tab has links to rule catalogs for each of those validations. So there's an essential geometry validation rule catalog. There's NINA attribute check validation rule catalog, an essential network validation rule catalog. Those rule catalogs are available for you to download and review. I believe Jonathan also has copies of them. So that you can see what is actually being checked by those validations. One thing I didn't mention was an automation mode. So as you are running your data through, and as you're becoming more of an expert on running data through it as a submitter, as a contributor, you might find that your schema is pretty static and you don't feel the need to every time go and check configure mapping. We do have automation modes. There is a little ellipses next to the continue button, and you can change the automation mode from interactive, which is the default, where you have to go and each step continue it and progress it to the next step. You can change the automation mode to until processing is complete, until finished, or until finished and closed. So again, by default, the submission is in interactive mode, but you can switch it to one of those others. And then you can also turn on notifications. I mentioned there's that bell at the top right for notifications. If you turn on notifications every time it hits that next part, so if you set it to until processing complete, once processing is complete, it'll notify you and the system will email you. So it'll actually send you an email and say, your submission has finished, or it has processed until complete. So you can actually receive emails notifying you that your submission is ready for you to go back and progress it to the next step, or review that process submission, or even review your submission results. Now, this option is beneficial if you have data set with static schema, with the same schema that you've submitted to an assignment already, to the same assignment already. Otherwise, I do recommend going through those steps in interactive mode, especially if it's the first time that you're submitting data to an assignment, or if the schema has changed and you need to make sure that the configure mapping is mapping the correct source schema to the correct target schema. But once you've got the same schema and you're a pro at submitting data through, automation modes is definitely very helpful with saving some time. Finally, I'm just going to emphasize saving your schema mapping. So it does allow you to manage that schema mapping. You can save up to 10 schema mappings per assignment. That's especially helpful if you're submitting for different suppliers, or if you are submitting for different locations that might have different schema for their address points, for their road center lines. And it does prevent you from having to remap your classes and your attributes repeatedly after your initial submission. So saving your schema mapping, we usually advise doing that, especially the first time you go through, go ahead and save it, because you do have that ability now to go through and make any edits to saved schema mappings, or you can even create your saved schema mapping before you even submit to an assignment. Finally, I do want to point out the schedule that we have for Arkansas 911. You should see assignments for essential geometry validations, essential network validations for road center lines, NINA attribute validations, and boundary gap and overlap. So identifying gaps and overlaps between boundary polygons, boundary areas. Coming up next month, we have cross feature validations that we will begin to release, as well as in the new year, we'll start allowing change detection, and that is where your submission is compared to a previous submission within the central repository and inside the database for Arkansas, and it identifies any changes. So if you've got a new neighborhood that's been created, it'll identify those as additions. Or if address points no longer exist in that data set, maybe they've been deleted or removed for one reason or another, change detection will identify those as deletions. Or if the attributes have changed, it'll identify any of those scalar updates. Excuse me. So our change detection process, as well as statewide cross-jurisdictional validations, will be made available in the new year. And with that, We do have time for questions. Again, if you're still having any issues logging into the portal, or if you still haven't received that activation email, please let us know in the chat now. We do still have some time so we can help troubleshoot. Any additional questions regarding submissions can be sent to Jonathan. I have his email there. And if those are issues that need to be raised up to One Spatial, he will make sure that that is brought to our attention. And again, thank you for your time. My name's Carolyn Kupek. I'm the technical trainer at One Spatial. We've also had Sarah, who's our solutions manager for our public safety next generation 911 solution. And I believe John Brady's also been on the chat. I've seen him pop up once or twice. He's one of our principal consultants at One Spatial. And then I've also seen Lillian join. She's our account exec for Arkansas 911. So again, thank you for your time. Please let us know if you have any questions. You can either unmute yourself and ask them, or you can submit them in the chat. I'm actually going to quickly go through the chat and make sure there's any questions that have been unanswered. I just want to thank you all for your time, and I appreciate you spending the morning with us.
Hey, Carolyn, this is Jennifer again, and thank you for your time. So you had mentioned earlier when I asked about the schema mapping that you would show us how you can save a schema mapping before you go through your assignment. And it's, yeah.
So in saved mappings, I mean, here I've got Benton County and Benton County address points. So let me see if I can find one. I think road center lines, I haven't seen one here. Oh, there's one that's been created. But let's say I want to create a new one. So I have my road center line NINA attribute validation open here. I'm going to just click the new. You can create a new mapping, or you can copy from an existing mapping. Now here, this looks to me like I only have, so far these top 4 are for address. You can see how it says address single layer validations. That's the project, which again, we've grouped by layer. And then it has the assignment. So SSAP is site structure address point essential geometry. And then finally, the one with the clipboard is the supplier. So if I'm creating a new mapping and I'm copying from a different mapping, I would want to make sure I'm using the same layer. So we do have some down here. Someone has a road single layer validation, again, for One Spatial tester. I'm not sure what the current accepted data, where that's from. So maybe instead of copying, I want to do a new mapping. We're going to start off by just putting in, I think what I have is Franklin County. So we'll just do an example, and I'll just say road center lines. If you do see a little question mark, hover over it. It's usually a help function. For some reason, they're still very tiny, but we're just looking for a descriptive name here and unique to the assignment. This is a unique name for the assignment, so it should be accepted. I'll hit create. It's going to save that mapping, or it's going to create a save mapping, but it's kind of empty at the moment. So what I need to do is provide it with sample data. If I need to come back and like change what this is called, I can always change that name here and then just hit the save button. My sample data, I'm going to drag and drop the sample data I've been using so far. It should up, there we go. And then I can go to schema mapping. And I can see it's got target classes and unmapped source classes. So I'm going to choose from my source, which is that data that I've kind of uploaded. And I'm going to choose lines, because that'll be my representing my road center lines. I'm going to expand out this task here, and I can go through these. Now, target, again, is the schema that lives inside the portal. As a One Spatial employee and consultant, I'm very familiar with our target schema. I'm less familiar with the uploaded schema. However, if you're more familiar with your uploaded schema, your source schema, you might prefer to swap that mapping direction, because you'll know add num pre L And you want to find what that is represented by here in our dropdown, in our target schema. So I'm going to assume that's your address number prefix for left, which is left address number prefix. And I'm just going to go through, this is add num pre R, would be right address number prefix. I don't think there's an authority left or right. I do know there is a country left and a country right. As you're going through the NINA attributes, you'll notice that our target schema is based on the descriptive names of the NINA data model, GIS data model. So instead of country underscore L, it's country underscore left. Instead of county L, it's county left, etc. So I'm going to go through this. I'm going to select the ones that I have in my data and that I see in the target schema. And then once I'm done, there's a lot. So once I'm done, at the very bottom, I'm going to hit save. So now my schema mapping has been updated. It's been saved. Let's say it's time for a coffee break. I'm not exactly done, but mentally I need to have a little moment. If I log
Because
out,
that's
log
what
back
mapping
in.
does.
No worries. We understand. That's why you've got a save button. I can go back to that save mapping. It was my Franklin County that I was working on pre-coffee. Now I've got my coffee. I'm ready to come back in here and I'm ready to finish this.
So
I've already uploaded that schema, that sample data. So my schema mapping, I just need to finish my work here.
So this mapping, I can only apply to any other assignments that are 1.2.3 or whatever that one is, right?
Not
I can,
necessarily.
no, okay.
If you want to say, for example, we don't have the cross-feature validations released just yet, but in the future, you can. Let's go back to my assignments, and I'm going to choose one. RCL network is similar to RCL essential geometry, which is similar to address point essential geometry, etc. The schema for network is just going to need a unique identifier and a geometry. So if I go into RCL network and I want to create a save mapping here, I don't have any save mappings at the moment. Let's say I want to create a new one. Again, I'm basing this on my Franklin County. I can use the same name because it's a different assignment. Let's say I want to copy. Let's go here. I'm going to copy that Franklin County one. I'm going to copy from that road centerlines NINA to my submitted data. So I'm copying from, that is the data set that is used for the NINA attribute validation. I'm copying to the data set that is used for my network validation. Now in this is where I'm going to just give it my Franklin County center lines. Again, it just needs to be unique to the assignment so I can reuse the name. When I hit copy, it's going to identify matches between Road Centerline's NINA template and One Data Gateway submitted data. Now my One Data Gateway submitted data only needs unique ID and geometry. So if I populated my unique ID in this one, it'll copy it to this one, but it has to be the same. If you are familiar with the NINA GIS data model, it doesn't use unique ID. It uses NGUID, or it actually uses road NGUID. So that one, I'm not going to assume it's going to copy over. Geometry should copy over. So when I hit copy, I'm going to do that matching in the background. My schema mapping here, nothing's going to be mapped. And again, also because the source class wasn't exactly the same. So I would need to just kind of do this part myself and find that site NGUID. Or sorry, not site, because I'm not looking at address points, my RCL NGUID. But it did know geometry mapped over. So it carried that one over. So this copying saved mappings makes more sense when we're looking at the NINA attributes and copying between assignments for different suppliers. And then also when you're copying NINA attributes for cross-feature validations. So those cross-feature validations might rely on the street names. The street names are those that I want to be able to copy over. So I don't have to map street name, post-directional, pre-directional, etc. But now that you've created that one, you can save it. So I don't necessarily have to stick within like 1.2.3 or the 1.2.2. You can copy it from other ones as well, but it's only going to copy over attributes that are the same class and the same attribute names. It does that matching for you. And it has to be the same target to the same source.
I think I get it. Thank you for taking the time to do that.
No worries. I do hope it saves you some more time in the future, less frustration. And that's why we do have those save mappings to help save y'all some time, especially as you start submitting data, especially data that has a very static schema. Are there any other questions I can answer? Gary, yes. You might be on mute.
Yeah, Gary, if you have a question and can't unmute, you can add it to the chat box and we'll make sure to respond there. And speaking of the chat box, I may just run through a few of these questions we've been discussing. There's been some really good chatter there and some great questions from you all. So yeah, just starting from some of the first questions. Let's see, Greg asked if there was an option to upload data from a service or a REST endpoint instead of actually loading the zipped file geodatabase. And yes, so we are planning on doing that for our next release. We release updates twice a year. And so we're in the middle of an update. So it'll actually happen for our spring 2023 release that you'll receive that enhancement. So instead of needing to zip your data, if you already have, a feature service out there, you'll be able to drop the link, save that in our system, and it can grab the data that way. So that was a really great question and something I wanted to mention that's coming down the pike. All right. So next up, we're talking about, the activation emails, of course. So please let us know if you're not getting that activation link. We can send you something directly from our personal emails instead. But yeah, your login name will be your email address has already been mentioned, and you'll set your password that first time after clicking on that link. Some other questions were around, what data do I upload? What schema? Yeah, so ideally it needs to be your entire database. If it's already in the NINA schema, great. That's where we need to be for Next Gen 911. If it's not, then just any zipped geo database will work. But instead of uploading, just a handful of features, it's best practice just to go ahead and load your data. It runs really quickly through, especially those geometry checks and network checks, and run in really a matter of seconds to minutes, depending on the size of your database. So you'll be able to get the results quickly, even if you load the entire thing. And again, as already mentioned, if you go through that, a little bit of a painful schema mapping process the first time and save it, then you won't have to do that in the future. And so our recommendation is to go through that NINA schema mapping first, just to get that out of the way, because that's the bulk of your attributes, right? You're gonna have everything listed there for your site structure address points and your road center lines. So once you get that saved, then you can copy that over into anywhere else your address points or center lines are being used throughout the system. And so this will really help with our next releases when we're doing the cross-feature validation. So comparing your address points to center lines, your location data to boundaries. That'll be coming out next month, and we'll give you a separate training. So we're going to meet a few different times. This was just an intro to the system. We'll do another training for you after the holidays, even though we're releasing the updates before the holidays, we want to make sure you have that break and that we come back refreshed, and we will give you another training session in January to talk about those cross-feature validations. After the cross feature, we'll do another release for the change detection. And again, change detection is just a different terminology for data aggregation. So you're going to be submitting your data to the statewide database through our change detection process. And so that's how the state will be getting your updates going forward once we release that change detection module in January. And so we'll meet up again probably in February to have our final training session on that and talk about, data aggregation. And yeah, that takes us to the end of the training. So we'll receive 3 different trainings. I think that covered everything in the chat. I know there was some back and forth about whether or not the Arkansas 911 schema is the NENA schema. And yeah, we did some comparison, and it does follow the NENA data model. And just for your awareness, the NENA data model V2 was just released last month. And I'm part of a working group that's working on the new data model template. So we'll have a template geodatabase and a Postgres database as well, that we'll be publishing. Hopefully, fingers crossed, early January, just after the holidays, we'll get that new template out. And so, yeah, I'll be reaching out to Jonathan, your team, when the template's ready, if you guys want to take a look at incorporating the NENA updates. So I think that covered what I wanted to talk about. So thank you so much, Carolyn.
No worries. Well, we do still have 15 minutes of our time here. So if you do have any other questions, we're happy to address those now. I do see a question about if corrections made through OneSpatial will be transferred to MSAG, ALI, ADR, or Google.
So, Carolyn, I saw that it was just about to answer, but the quick answer, Rudy, is no. Obviously, things like the MSAG and the ALI are separate from your local GIS data. These tools are primarily focused on your local GIS data. However, once you are fully put over onto the ESINet and fully I3, the MSAG then becomes a function of your GIS data. At that point, somewhere down in the future, you'll have what's referred to as a geo MSAG. And essentially what that is right now the MSAG is a essentially a tabular database, think of it that way, that exists totally separate from any of your GIS data. And in the future, once you have that geo MSAG, that MSAG is created from your GIS data. So, right now the answer is no, but in the future, the answer sort of becomes yes, because as you maintain and edit your GIS data, then that's what gets fed into the MSAG. And then the answer to Google, we wish the answer was yes, but unfortunately the answer is no. That would, if we could make that happen, then everybody would be happy.
Thanks, Jonathan.
I think it might also be good to point out that the corrections are actually being made at the local office, that not the one spatial isn't actually making the corrections, that they're just sort of identifying what needs to be corrected, just to, you know, be specific on the wording.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. That's these tools are a way to find, locate, or identify the things that need to be fixed. So then once you see what those are, you know, those corrections can be made, and then you would submit your data back through the portal. And, you know, if it shows up with, you run your data through and it shows up with 1,000 errors, you fix those, and then hopefully you run it back through, you know, there would be 0 errors. And one other thing I'll mention, and I mentioned this earlier, you know, many of you who have already worked with us are familiar with the, you know, this idea of critical errors. And that's, you know, that's coming from when your data is uploaded to the Intrado system, which is the, you know, step to getting it into the ESI net. And the idea being that that process continues because that's actually uploading it into the ESI net. But with these tools, what you should be able to do is find and correct errors before the data ever gets to our office, so that over time, you know, any critical errors you're getting would be, you sort of have this situation or scenario of diminishing returns. So, you know, as you continue to edit your data and continue to evaluate it again with these tools, then hopefully the number of critical errors that show up, you know, at the Intrado stage over time become fewer and fewer. And I'm hearing a lot of silence, Carolyn.
Well, I liked
This
your
last
last.
time. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I liked the last sentence there because it was sort of hopeful. Thanks, Jonathan.
Well, what was my last sentence? I've already forgotten.
That it's going to be, it might be kind of difficult at first, but as we move along, there'll be fewer and fewer things to fix.
Yeah.
Maybe, is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. Thanks.
I do see a question as to if there's a deadline.
And also, I see there a question also from Bryce. So, Alyssa, you mentioned, is there a deadline? Not necessarily sure what deadline you might be referring to, but really the only deadlines in this entire process are driven from the, you know, AT&T and that overall implementation process. So that's kind of the timeline we're working around, but there's not necessarily a deadline for you, you know, start using the One Spatial portal. We would hope as soon as possible. But yeah, there's no specific time frame. And Bryce, you had a question about does the data essentially have to be critical error free in order to start using the portal? Absolutely not, because that's really what this is for, to find those. You know, if you can, you know, it would, if you find and fix critical errors or any errors before you run it through, great. It would, you know, but these set of tools are very robust and are going to be looking for most likely a lot more things than you would be looking for in your normal day-to-day work. So I would say it's very doubtful that your data would be error-free when you submitted it into the One Spatial tools, simply because it's going to, or those tools are going to look for a lot more things than you normally would.
But the
I'll mention
reverse would
something.
apply. That, sorry, I was just going to say, if you go through the One Spatial tools and your data comes out, or eventually at some point error free, there's a very good chance that when you submit it to us for upload to ESINet, that it would be critical error free through that. There's no guarantees on that, but there's a very good chance that it would be critical error free at that stage. Once you've corrected all
That's
the
basically
errors.
that's what we hope to accomplish with this, is by the time the data gets to us for load into the ESINet, that it's critical error free already or very close to it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll mention that we have wrapped in those specific, thresholds and validations that they're running into our validation tool. So, we're looking for the same types of gaps and overlaps and duplicates and everything that they're looking for in their tool. So yeah, that's really the goal, is to clean up your data through our system before it gets caught in the ESINet. And then the only requirements, again, for using our system is that you have that zipped file geodatabase. You have a unique ID on your data sets. And if you don't have that specific NINA, the NGUID field yet, you can use your object ID temporarily. But know that NINA does require that NGUID to be unique and populated in their format eventually. But yeah, if you don't have that and you just want to run these checks, just use the object ID to get that unique identifier in there. We do need that to write out those spatial markup results so you can, have something to compare back to your original data. So yeah, really the only requirement is a unique ID. And then for some of the validations, like your road centerline to road centerline checks, you will need a street name field as well. That's about it.
And I just received a question in an email from Jefferson County, and I'm responding to her, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it out loud because we have several other counties that are in this same situation, and that they are already almost a live GOMSAG. And so she was asking for those counties that are completed and are moving forward and almost live, do they have to resubmit everything that they've done into this portal? And the answer is yes, eventually, but you do not have to right now at this time. And that can wait until the next upload process. And when we upload the next changes in your data, that you can start submitting them through this portal and using it at that time.
I'd like to also point out something for Alyssa's question. Was there a deadline? I think, I'm not entirely sure what that might entail, that question, but it's good to point out that in the future, once everything is implemented, there will be a schedule for when each county will be submitting their updates or their changes or further data. And I believe it's based on population. I don't know a whole lot about that, but I know that once we get to that point, there'll be, an update on a scheduled basis.
Are there any other questions? If you do have other questions, again, please feel free to send those to Jonathan and his team at the Arkansas GIS office.
And as the account executive for Arkansas, I'll go ahead and drop my email in the chat just in case anyone needs to get in wants to get in contact with me. Carolyn, great job today.
I do see there's a question about training for those other assignments. So as those other assignments are released, as Sarah mentioned, we will provide additional training. Those invites will come out as we schedule them with Jonathan's office. So you'll see invites, most likely coming from my email address.
And Bryce, this is Jonathan. All the tools that are available to you now are all single layer validations, as opposed to comparing, one to another or something like that. So yeah, at this point, you should be fully capable of running any of those validations that show up when you log in now. And Alyssa, yeah, I know there are a couple other counties out there that are former CenturyLink, whatever they used to be. But I would have to look back to see. I'm thinking maybe Woodruff County, but I would have to do a little research. We'd have to confirm those. Yep. So there are some out there. Now that just adds a little bit of another wrinkle to the alley database. Carolyn, Sarah, I think we're right at the top of the hour at noon, which is the time we had allotted. And, not any other questions popping up, and the chat has died down. But
hold on, I have another
oops,
question
got
in
one.
email. I'm sorry. Did Gary get his question answered about those of us who could not log in to set up the portal? Did he receive help on that?
Are you talking about activating his user
I believe so.
account?
Yeah, he just asked, can you ask about those of us who could not log in to set up the portal?
Gary, if you're still out there, I'm not looking at the attendees, but Gary, if you're still out there, I'll resend an activation link for you. But you may have to look in your spam folder, junk folder, whatever other folder to find it.
Yeah, and for anybody that mentioned that, I resent the activation link through our system. So it's coming from, that one spatial admin account. But what we may need to do if you're still not getting it, like maybe you have some IT settings that are in place that are throwing it into quarantine. You may not see the quarantine until the end of the week. But yeah, reach out to Jonathan or myself. That'd be fine too. And we'll get you a direct link from our email address.
Katie, have we got any others filtering in?
Not that I'm seeing. I think we're good.
All right. Well, I certainly appreciate everybody taking the time to join us this morning. I know that was a lot to digest in a couple hours, but it's going to be like it's something new, and we fully anticipate it being a little bit of a learning curve for you, but ultimately it's going to be a really good system for us. But with that, unless Sarah or Carolyn, you have anything else, I think we're safe to adjourn.
I will just quickly mention that we would like to send out a One Data Gateway contributor training survey. So if you have any comments about the training, we really appreciate feedback so that we can continue to improve this. And especially because we have additional trainings for y'all at Arkansas, we want to make sure that any improvements are implemented prior to those upcoming trainings. So you'll see, I'll send out a link to that survey after we finish our training today, so later this afternoon.
right. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending. We'll make sure to send you copies of the recording, Jonathan, and all of the material if you want to disperse that. And yeah, we look forward to meeting up for our next training in January. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.
Thanks a lot.
You too.
Thanks,
Thank
you
you.
too.
Thanks,
Y'all
everyone.
have a good one.